In a small village called Belmonte, tucked into the mountains of northeastern Portugal, a community of families spent more than 500 years secretly lighting candles in the back rooms of their homes every Friday night, quietly closing the shutters first so no neighbor could see the flickering light. They told outsiders, and eventually told their own children, that this was simply an old family custom, a private ritual nobody could quite explain. It wasn't until the 1920s that a Polish mining engineer traveling through the region happened to notice these same families discreetly sweeping dust toward the center of their kitchen floors rather than out the front door, and asked one elderly woman directly why she did it. She reportedly wept, and finally told him the truth her own family had been forbidden from speaking aloud for nearly half a millennium, that they were Jews, descendants of families forced to convert to Catholicism during the Inquisition, who had continued practicing their actual faith in near total secrecy for 19 consecutive generations. This is a true, documented story, verified by later genetic researchers who traveled to Belmonte specifically to study its residents' DNA. And it turns out Belmonte is far from unique. Modern genetic science has now confirmed that millions of families across Spain, Portugal, Latin America, and the American Southwest carry the same hidden ancestral signature, the direct, traceable genetic legacy of Sephardic Jews, who were forced underground more than 5 centuries ago, and whose descendants, in many documented cases, never fully realized exactly what they were actually carrying inside their own family history. To understand how an entire hidden lineage like this could survive undetected for centuries, you first have to understand exactly what happened to Spain and Portugal's Jewish population beginning in the late 14th century. Following a devastating wave of anti-Jewish riots that swept across Spain in 1391, followed by the formal Alhambra decree issued in 1492, which gave Spain's entire Jewish population somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 people, a stark choice between converting to Christianity or being permanently expelled from the country. An enormous number of Jewish families chose conversion specifically to remain in the only home they had ever known. Portugal followed with its own nearly identical decree in 1497, forcing roughly 120,000 additional Jews into the same impossible choice. Many of these so-called New Christians, as Spanish and Portuguese authorities officially called them, genuinely did convert and assimilate fully. But a significant number instead became what historians now call anusim, a Hebrew term meaning the coerced or the forced ones, families who outwardly practiced Catholicism in public, attending Mass, having their children baptized, and displaying every outward sign of Christian devotion, while continuing to secretly practice Judaism behind closed doors, at genuine constant risk of torture or execution if the Spanish or Portuguese Inquisition ever discovered the truth. The specific mechanisms these families developed to preserve their hidden faith across generations, while remaining completely undetectable to suspicious neighbors and the Inquisition's own network of informants, produced exactly the kind of quiet, unexplained domestic customs that eventually became known as the specific hidden signs family historians and genetic researchers now look for. Families in the American Southwest, descendants of crypto-Jewish settlers who had fled the Inquisition by relocating to the furthest, most remote edges of the Spanish colonial empire in what is now New Mexico, Colorado, and Texas, maintained these exact same practices for generations, often without any remaining living memory of why they were actually doing them. Lighting candles, specifically on Friday evening, the traditional beginning of the Jewish Sabbath, was disguised within Catholic households as simply an ordinary evening ritual. Avoiding pork entirely, even while publicly identifying as devout Catholics in a culture where pork remained a dietary staple, became a quiet, consistent family pattern that neighbors sometimes noticed but rarely questioned directly. Sweeping dust and debris toward the center of a room rather than out through the front doorway traces directly back to the Jewish law prohibiting the carrying of items across a threshold on the Sabbath, a practice these families maintained even after entirely forgetting its original religious purpose. Burying the dead within 24 hours whenever possible, rather than following the more extended Catholic funeral customs common throughout the surrounding community, reflects the specific, considerably faster burial requirements found in traditional Jewish religious law. And families in several documented cases specifically avoided placing any cross or overtly Christian religious imagery directly on grave markers, instead favoring plain, unadorned headstones, a subtle but genuinely telling deviation from surrounding community burial customs that later genealogists and historians have specifically flagged as a recurring marker among suspected crypto-Jewish family burial sites. Genealogist Shelley Talali Dardashti, an expert specifically focused on this exact area of Jewish family history research, has described the specific culture of silence surrounding these traditions in genuinely stark terms, noting that families who actually carried this hidden history rarely discussed it openly even amongst themselves, summarizing the informal, unspoken family rule many descendants grew up under using a specific, memorable phrase. still repeated throughout parts of New Mexico today: deny until you die. That culture of enforced silence meant an enormous number of families maintained these specific inherited practices for literally centuries without any remaining conscious awareness of their actual religious origin, treating them simply as unusual, old-fashioned family quirks passed down without explanation from one generation to the next, precisely the kind of quiet cultural fossil that genetic testing has only recently begun to properly explain. It's exactly this specific combination, documented historical persecution driving families into hiding, combined with genuinely inherited, unexplained domestic customs passed down across many generations, that eventually led modern population geneticists to start directly investigating whether these specific family traditions actually corresponded to any measurable, confirmable genetic signature. The most extensively studied case involves that same village of Belmonte in Portugal, along with several similarly isolated communities in the nearby Bragança district. Researchers conducting detailed mitochondrial DNA analysis, tracing genetic lineage specifically along the maternal line, found something genuinely striking once they compared Belmonte's own crypto-Jewish descendants against the broader surrounding Portuguese population. In Belmonte specifically, researchers found an unusually narrow range of genetic diversity, with a single maternal lineage accounting for more than 93% of all 30 individuals originally studied, a genuinely striking pattern consistent with a small, deeply isolated founding population that had, for centuries, deliberately avoided marrying outside its own tight-knit religious community, specifically to preserve both its genetic and cultural continuity. When researchers subsequently expanded their study to include additional crypto-Jewish descendant communities scattered throughout the wider Bragança district, they found a genuinely different, considerably more diverse picture, identifying 5 separate maternal genetic lineages that researchers specifically concluded represented likely authentic Sephardic founding lineages, evidence that, unlike the unusually inbred population of Belmonte specifically, these broader communities had actually managed to avoid the kind of severe genetic bottleneck centuries of religious isolation might otherwise have been expected to produce. The genetic story extends considerably further than a handful of isolated Portuguese villages, though, and this is where the research becomes genuinely relevant to a considerably larger number of people than most casual observers would ever expect. A landmark genetic study published in 2018 examined DNA data collected from Hispanic and Latino populations across the wider Americas, and the resulting finding was genuinely striking. Roughly 25% of Hispanic and Latino individuals across the Americas carry detectable genetic markers specifically consistent with Sephardic Jewish ancestry, a direct, measurable genetic echo of exactly the same mass-forced conversions that swept across Spain and Portugal more than 5 centuries earlier. Separate research specifically analyzing the underlying colonial demographics behind this genetic pattern estimates that up to 20% of contemporary Spaniards and roughly 10% of the broader population of Iberian colonial settlers who eventually populated Latin America likely carried some degree of Sephardic heritage themselves, though that specific percentage varied dramatically by exact region, in certain documented colonial territories reaching as high as nearly 1 in 3 settlers, while remaining essentially negligible in other areas entirely. Given that Latin America's overall population today exceeds 590 million people, the overwhelming majority of whom carry at least partial Iberian ancestry, researchers studying this specific question estimate that up to 50 million people living across the Americas today may carry some genuine degree of Sephardic Jewish ancestry, a genuinely staggering number for a specific historical population that, at the actual moment of the original Inquisition, numbered only in the low hundreds of thousands. Beyond simply confirming that this ancestry genuinely exists at a population level, more detailed genetic research has specifically worked to trace exactly how and through which specific historical migration routes this ancestry actually spread. A detailed genomic study specifically examining Sephardic genetic signatures across the wider Iberian Peninsula used a sophisticated statistical technique to model exactly how different historical migrant populations had contributed to the modern genetic makeup of various Iberian and North African populations, explicitly distinguishing genuine Sephardic Jewish genetic contribution from separate, historically distinct North African Berber and broader Mediterranean genetic influences that had also shaped the region's population over many centuries. That same research specifically found measurable, statistically significant Sephardic genetic contribution, not just within Spain and Portugal themselves, but extending into southern France and Italy as well, direct genetic confirmation that families fleeing the original Inquisition had scattered across a considerably wider swath of Europe than popular historical accounts typically emphasize, carrying their own hidden ancestry, and, in many documented cases, their own carefully preserved hidden religious practices along with them. It's also worth exploring in more depth exactly how the Cohen modal haplotype, one of the single most widely cited pieces of genetic evidence in this entire field, actually came to be discovered, because its story adds a genuinely important additional layer to the broader question of tracing Jewish ancestry through DNA. In the mid-1990s, researchers studying the Y chromosome, the specific genetic material passed down exclusively through the direct paternal line, made a genuinely striking discovery while comparing genetic samples collected from Jewish men who identified as Kohanim, members of the specific hereditary priestly line traditionally believed, according to Jewish oral tradition, to descend directly from the biblical figure Aaron, brother of Moses. Researchers found that a specific, unusually consistent set of genetic markers appeared at a significantly elevated frequency among self-identified Kohanim, compared to the broader Jewish population, a pattern consistent with a distinct, shared paternal lineage stretching back many centuries, potentially even reaching as far back as the biblical era the underlying oral tradition itself describes. This specific genetic marker set became known throughout the field as the Cohen modal haplotype, and its discovery represented one of the first genuinely striking instances of genetic science appearing to directly corroborate a specific, previously unverifiable oral religious tradition passed down across many generations. Subsequent research has since found that same specific genetic signature appearing at meaningfully elevated frequencies among certain populations with documented or suspected crypto-Jewish ancestry as well, including some communities in Spain, Portugal, and Latin America, adding yet another distinct genetic thread researchers have used to help trace and corroborate this specific hidden ancestral history. It's also genuinely worth examining the specific, often overlooked role that historical records from the Inquisition itself have played in helping modern researchers and genealogists actually verify and corroborate these genetic findings, because the Inquisition, despite its own genuinely brutal, often deeply unjust methods, left behind an extraordinarily detailed paper trail that historians have since been able to mine for genuinely valuable family history information. Inquisition tribunals meticulously documented the specific names, family relationships, and alleged religious practices of the tens of thousands of individuals they investigated and prosecuted over the centuries. And these surviving archival records, however uncomfortable their original context, now serve as one of the single most valuable genealogical resources available to modern researchers, specifically attempting to trace documented crypto-Jewish family lines. Professional genealogists specifically focused on Sephardic family history have specifically noted that combining this kind of detailed archival documentation with modern genetic testing offers a considerably more rigorous, considerably more scientifically defensible path toward actually confirming a specific family's crypto-Jewish ancestry than genetic testing or oral family tradition could ever fully achieve, working entirely in isolation from one another. Though researchers have also specifically cautioned that Inquisition records themselves must be approached with real historical skepticism, since accusations brought before Inquisition, tribunals were frequently motivated by neighborly disputes, financial jealousy, or other entirely unrelated personal grievances rather than genuine religious suspicion, meaning being formally named in surviving Inquisition documentation doesn't automatically, definitively confirm that a specific historical individual was actually practicing Judaism in secret at all. It's genuinely important, though, to understand exactly what these specific genetic findings can and cannot actually confirm about any individual family's own personal history, because this is precisely the area where legitimate, peer-reviewed genetic research and considerably less rigorous popular genealogy claims tend to diverge sharply. Professional genealogists, specifically focused on Sephardic family history research, have repeatedly publicly cautioned against treating unexplained family customs, or even a positive genetic test result showing elevated Mediterranean or Sephardic-associated ancestry, as absolute definitive proof of direct Jewish ancestral descent on its own. Genetic testing companies can identify statistical patterns strongly associated with historical Sephardic populations. But, as researchers studying this exact question have specifically noted, there currently exists no single, universally distinct Sephardic or Jewish genetic marker capable of definitively proving ancestry with complete scientific certainty in every individual case, precisely because centuries of extensive intermarriage with surrounding non-Jewish populations has genuinely blurred and diluted whatever originally distinct genetic signature these communities may once have carried. Respected Sephardic genealogical organizations have gone further still, specifically warning that a small industry of individuals and organizations has emerged in recent years, selling official-sounding certificates of Sephardic ancestry, based on evidence that, according to professional genealogists who have reviewed these documents, frequently falls well short of accepted genealogical or scientific standards, a genuinely important caution for anyone encountering this kind of claim online. There's also a genuinely important distinction worth understanding between carrying documented Sephardic genetic ancestry and actually being considered Jewish, according to traditional Jewish religious law. A distinction that carries real, practical significance for the growing number of Bnei Anusim, literally children of the coerced, actively seeking to formally reconnect with Jewish religious and communal life today. Traditional Jewish law generally traces religious status specifically through the maternal line, meaning genetic evidence alone, particularly evidence drawn from broader autosomal ancestry testing rather than specifically maternal mitochondrial DNA, cannot definitively establish religious status on its own, regardless of how compelling the underlying genetic or historical evidence for Sephardic ancestry might otherwise genuinely appear. Rabbinic authorities examining specific individual cases have, in some documented instances, concluded that a particular family's own claimed crypto-Jewish history, however sincerely and passionately believed, ultimately lacked the specific kind of documented, verifiable maternal line evidence traditional religious law actually requires, meaning full formal conversion rather than a more simplified process of religious return, was still considered necessary under Jewish legal tradition. This complicated, genuinely emotionally fraught intersection between genuine historical trauma, inherited family tradition, modern genetic science, and centuries-old religious legal frameworks continues to generate real, occasionally difficult tension within contemporary Jewish communities, actively working to welcome descendants of crypto-Jewish families back into full communal life today. It's also worth exploring the specific, genuinely moving process many descendants actually go through once they begin seriously investigating a suspected crypto-Jewish family history, because the emotional journey itself has become a genuinely well-documented recurring pattern among the growing community of people actively researching exactly this question. Organizations including Reconnectar and Shavei Israel have specifically emerged over the past 2 decades to help guide descendants of crypto-Jewish families through exactly this kind of investigation. And, for those who wish to pursue it, eventual formal reconnection with organized Jewish religious life. Ashley Perry, a former advisor to Israel's own Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who now leads Reconnector specifically, has publicly noted that many contemporary Jewish religious leaders remain genuinely, largely unaware of the specific historical severity crypto-Jewish families actually endured, describing the centuries-long experience many of these families lived through using genuinely blunt, direct language, comparing their sustained secrecy and constant fear of discovery to living under something resembling Gestapo-like surveillance for hundreds of consecutive years. For many individual descendants actually going through this specific process today, the journey typically begins with exactly the kind of unexplained family tradition or persistent oral history discussed throughout this entire account, followed by increasingly serious genealogical and genetic investigation, and culminating, for those who choose to pursue it, in a formal process of religious study, and, in many documented cases, eventual conversion or religious return, a deeply personal journey that connects a modern individual directly back to ancestors who risked genuine mortal danger specifically to preserve the same religious identity their own descendants are now actively working to reclaim 5 centuries later. It's also worth situating the New Mexico crypto-Jewish community specifically within the broader context of Spanish colonial expansion into the Americas, because understanding exactly why these families ended up settling in such a remote, isolated corner of the eventual United States helps explain why their specific traditions managed to survive relatively undisturbed for so many additional centuries after the original Inquisition itself had formally ended. Historian Stanley Hordes, whose own detailed 2005 book on the subject remains one of the single most thorough academic treatments of this specific community, documented how a meaningful number of the earliest Spanish colonial settlers who ventured into the far northern frontier territories of New Spain, the vast, remote region that would eventually become New Mexico, Colorado, and parts of Texas, appear to have specifically, deliberately chosen this particular remote frontier precisely because its extreme distance from Mexico City and the more heavily populated centers of Spanish colonial authority offered a genuinely meaningful additional layer of protection from ongoing Inquisition scrutiny. Families settling in these considerably more isolated frontier communities could practice whatever version of their inherited traditions they still privately maintained with meaningfully reduced risk of the kind of neighborhood surveillance and formal denunciation that remained a genuinely constant, serious danger in more densely populated colonial cities. This same geographic isolation, though, also meant these specific families remained cut off from any ongoing contact with organized Jewish religious life or scholarship for an extraordinarily long stretch of time, explaining why so many descendants eventually ended up faithfully maintaining specific inherited ritual behaviors, like Friday candle lighting or particular burial customs, while genuinely, completely losing any conscious understanding of the actual religious framework or meaning those specific practices had originally been designed to serve. It's also worth noting, finally, that the fundamental scientific challenge underlying this entire field, the sheer difficulty of using genetics alone to definitively confirm a specific historical, religious, or ethnic identity across 5 centuries of continuous intermarriage and cultural assimilation, reflects a genuinely broader, well-recognized limitation running throughout population genetics as a whole, not some unique flaw specific to Sephardic ancestry research alone. Researchers studying human population genetics more broadly have repeatedly emphasized that religious and cultural identity, unlike a specific discrete genetic mutation, simply doesn't leave behind the kind of single, unambiguous genetic marker that could ever definitively prove or disprove a specific family's historical religious affiliation with complete scientific certainty. What genetic testing can responsibly, legitimately offer instead is a meaningful, statistically grounded probability, a measurable elevation in genetic markers strongly associated with historical Sephardic populations, which, when combined with corroborating historical records, documented family oral traditions, and unexplained inherited customs passed down across many generations, together builds a genuinely compelling, if not absolutely mathematically certain, case for a specific family's likely crypto-Jewish ancestral history. It's precisely this kind of careful multi-source corroboration, rather than any single dramatic genetic test result taken entirely in isolation, that responsible genealogists and geneticists working in this field consistently recommend, and that has allowed families like those in Belmonte and countless others scattered from the Iberian Peninsula all the way to the American Southwest to finally, confidently confirm what their own grandmothers had quietly, faithfully preserved for generation after generation, long before anyone actually had the scientific tools available to properly explain exactly why. What makes this entire body of research so genuinely compelling, though, isn't any single dramatic genetic statistic on its own. It's the way hard genetic evidence and centuries of quiet, unexplained family tradition have increasingly, independently converged to confirm the exact same underlying historical story. Families in Belmonte spent 19 consecutive generations secretly lighting Friday night candles behind closed shutters without any outside confirmation whatsoever that their own private family ritual actually connected them directly to an entire hidden Jewish community numbering in the hundreds of thousands scattered across an entire hemisphere. Until a curious traveling engineer and, decades later, professional geneticists finally arrived to confirm what those families' own grandmothers had always quietly known but had been forbidden from ever openly discussing. Millions of families across the modern Hispanic and Latino world carry measurable genetic echoes of that exact same forced conversion and centuries-long concealment. Some fully aware of the family stories hinting at a hidden Jewish past, others discovering the connection for the very first time only after receiving an unexpected, genuinely startling genetic test result. And for a growing number of these families, the specific combination of an inherited family custom nobody could ever quite explain, a persistent oral tradition passed down but rarely discussed openly, and a modern DNA test finally confirming a genuine, measurable Sephardic genetic signature, has become this specific, deeply personal moment when centuries of enforced silence and centuries of carefully preserved secret memory finally, quietly come back together at last.